Right, greetings, hello. So we're now next door in Melpomene, who's the muse of tragedy, and she inspired tragic poetry. Love stories that go bad and end up in tragedy and so on, or wars. So Melpomene houses all the bad news of history. In this room you'll find books on all the wars of history. I mean, I'm interested as a military historian. I've studied in detail for my degree all the different wars, and also the history of intelligence is here, military intelligence. And especially now, wars are more fought on military intelligence than anything. Even World War II was won by the British and Americans and Russians because of our cracking the Enigma codes of the Germans. I have a book here called Hitler's Spies, which is a story of German intelligence in World War II, and it wasn't quite up to scratch. So also you find books on law here, so the constitutions of different countries. Law is the attempt to stop tragedy getting out of hand. This is why people are right when they say that Putin has broken international law, and therefore international law should kick in somehow. But what is the agency? The UN should obviously intervene. They should have sent in blue helmet troops into Ukraine to protect the civilians. I have in this room therefore a UN peacekeeper's beret. This is actually worn by a friend of a friend in action as a UN peacekeeper. Why aren't they doing more to prevent these wars? What do we need to do to the UN to make it more effective? So that's why I'm working with the World Intellectual Forum to increase its effectiveness. This is a picture of my mother, who was an anti-nuclear weapons campaigner for many years, Eileen Daffern. She was a peace activist even before I was born. You can say I'm just like an afterthought, the third of 3 children that carries on with her work. This is her banner, the Sussex Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament, which is an organisation that campaigned for nuclear disarmament in Sussex. They would organise meetings in Brighton and Hove, and this flag often went out on marches. And here's a picture of when it's out on a march with my mother. She worked with the International Peace Bureau, which is the main body of peace organisations. My Philosophers of Peace is a member of that. We have online meetings and so on. They've written a proposal of what kind of peace deal could end this war in Ukraine. With trying to think it through here. But the trouble is Putin and is not really thinking logically about what he's done or the consequences. So I try and see conflicts from all sides. Here you have books about the bombing of Dresden, the horrors of that, which was a war crime against the German people in my opinion. But you also have River of Fire about the bombing of Glasgow, which was a war crime against the Scottish people. And when I lived in Scotland, I researched all that. And books about the arms trade. When I talked about the economics of the arms trade, well, the books about the arms trade are in here. And why can't, arms dealers themselves realise that enough is enough? There are enough super weapons on the planet to self-destroy us. I'm in favour of life continuing and the experiment of life on this earth continuing. I don't want to end it tragically. This is the room of tragic endings. You also have books in here about the Holocaust. I've been to Auschwitz and others of the camps. It was horrendous what was done to these people. I've known Holocaust survivors, rabbis and things. And people that say it didn't happen just haven't done their homework. But I've also got books on other tragedies in history. Most recently I got into studying 9/11 in great detail, and I wrote a historical study of it, in which basically I started from the assumption that the official narrative simply isn't true. It wasn't just bin Laden and his team of box cutters that were able to bring those buildings down. They were pre-wired from within. So the question I ask in my study is, well, who pre-wired them? Like, was it this country? Was it that faction in the US government? Was it this group? And I look at these all logically. And I say as a historian, if we're going to find the truth out, we have to have a truth commission to investigate all this. And whilst the engineers and scientists have done their evidence to prove it wasn't just the planes, they couldn't have knocked the Twin Towers down, it's up to the humanities specialists, scholars of history like me, to now do the other work, which is, well, who was it? And in my 2 volumes, nearly 1,000 pages, I say, what do we need to find out to do it? How are we going to find out? And I don't think we know that yet. We don't have enough information. Okay, so I've also in this room got all the legal papers and documents to do with my mediation service. Because I set up in the mid-90s the only multi-faith mediation service that deals with conflict between religions. I thought it'd be straightforward. I published it in my PhD thesis, We took on 20 cases and very interesting stuff, including in Afghanistan, before 9/11. I was teaching at the Muslim college. We went to the Afghan embassy. We met the brother of Shah Ahmed Massoud. We went to try and talk to the Taliban. And we were all told, yeah, you've got to go and talk to the Americans. They're pulling the strings here. Because they're interested in pipelines throughout Afghanistan. And before you could blink, 9/11 happened. So history is a whole bunch of tragedies, which I'm kind of always trying to catch up with them and prevent the next one. It's like, it gets tedious after a while. It's like a teacher in the playground. You break up one fight, and then another one breaks out on the other end of the playground. How can we stop all these fights going? Well, my strategy is more information, more knowledge, more wisdom, more learning, more deep thought, more musing. We use the term to muse, means to channel the divine goddess energy onto the problem. Look at it from that higher perspective. I've been to Moscow. I know Russian philosophers in Moscow who are must be pulling their hair out because of this. The wisdom people of Russia don't want this war. The wisdom of people of Ukraine don't want it. Let's bring the wisdom people together, is what I'm doing with my World Intellectual Wisdom Forum and my institute and so on. And so I want this room to become, I don't want whole new books to have to come in here over the next 100 years. I want to bequeath this museum to the nation or to Europe, but I don't want it to be full of new wars keep breaking out. There's enough in here already. Slavery, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, which is also documented in here. The brutality of man to man is horrendous. I have a book in here about the horrors of what was done to the Polish people during World War II, because people forget the Poles suffered. And I grew up with this book when I was a boy. My parents, made me look at it, and it shows the horrendousness of the war crimes that were done. Auschwitz began as a Polish prisoners' camp, I learned when I went there. And it was only later turned into one especially for Jews. The Nazis wanted to kill off all the Polish intellectuals because they were a threat to Hitler's plans for Poland. And Stalin was doing the same thing from Eastern Poland. So it was a stitch-up job, which is what Tim Snyder points out in his amazing book, The Bloodlands, which is in here, about how that tragic area got clobbered both by the Nazis and by the Stalin troops. And the NKVD just rounded up Polish intellectuals and slaughtered them, just as the Nazis were doing as well. It's horrendous, So, yes, this stuff should be taught. It needs to be known about. School children need to go to these museums so that it doesn't happen again. What I don't understand is why does Putin not know any of this stuff? Did he never read books like this? Does he not know Tim Snyder's book, The Bloodlands? Does he not realise that Stalin had huge amounts of blood on his hands? Snyder points out, that Stalin was deeply immured in blood. Even before Hitler came to power, he'd been doing his Great Terror and his, killings and so on. And then by engineering the Holodmor, which is also in this room, and I have a book about the Stalinist leader called The Wolf in the Kremlin. This is the only biography of Lev Kaganovich, who was the Soviet henchman friend of Stalin, who basically did the Holodmor. And he also designed the Moscow metro, which I've travelled on. And this was all hushed up by the Soviet intellectuals. You weren't allowed to mention the Holodmor, the mass starvation by famine, and the killing of 3.9 million Ukrainians. And you weren't, as an intellectual, allowed to even mention that. And I think Putin's brought in new laws. You can't mention it now. Now, that's not how to build a fair and just society, to silence intellectuals like me. Fortunately, I live in France, which has a haven for intellectuals for the last 1,000 years. And, you know, we're not going to silence thinkers. So I think the poor old Russians need to get their act together and study the Holodmor more. It should be taught in Russian schools. And they should realise that horrors were done by Stalin. And this guy Putin is a sort of throwback. He seems to want to go back to Stalin's times. This is the book I was telling you about earlier, called The Black Book of Communism. And of course my mother, as a communist, never read this. She refused to read it. She said, "Oh, I can't read that. Too depressing." But I said, "Mum, you know, you've got to learn this stuff. If you seriously want peace, you have to know what was done in the name of communism." And that's produced by a team of scholars, Harvard University Press. And likewise, what Mao got away with was just like shocking. This biography is the best single critical study of Mao. I mean, the number of people he slaughtered on his way to power, and after he got into power, is just shocking, you know. Again, the Chinese are sort of seen through this game, and they've moved beyond Maoism, but there's a danger that they're sliding back into it. And I'm suspicious of Putin and the Chinese coming together. Like, what are they going to do? They want to go back to the 1950s, you know. This book is shocking because it reveals that Mao went to Moscow to see Stalin because he wanted the nuclear bomb from Stalin, who had it. We're in the early 1950s. And Stalin had Mao's dasher bugged. Somebody asked Mao, one of the, you know, Stalin's friends went and had a vodka with him, and said, "Well, what do you really think of this Marx guy?" And Mao said, because he was off duty, didn't know he was being listened to, he said, "Marx, I've never read him. I don't know anything about Marx." He confessed he'd never actually studied the guy. It was all just posturing. And actually, Mao was a bandit chieftain who used bandit methods to gain power. And he killed all the intellectuals, the actual Marxists. It's all documented in here, you know. So this room is the fight back by intellectuals against the madness and the corruption and the evil that tries to silence truth in, sadly, all around the world. And finally, I'll just finish by saying the other thing I've been looking at here is the Israel-Palestine conflict ongoing, the Nakba Palestinian story. Israelis arrive in Israel totally burned out after the Holocaust. You know, they want a home, and then through a series of tragic events, this ongoing tragedy escalates, and you have a series of wars between the tiny little Israel, which grows a little bit each time. How can we stop that? That's another tragedy, which I've been working on. I've been to Israel and Palestine, and I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. So there's a lot of books in here about all that, Middle East peace studies, and how we can solve that problem. You know, so this room is busy. It's a busy ongoing work that's being done here in Melpomene to try and prevent more books arriving and more tragedies happening. Because Melpomene, that's enough, you know, she's done enough tragedy. Let's get on to the happy news in history, please. Okay, I'll let you have a quick look round. That's actually the Charter of the United Nations. It's a bit faded now. It's a copy of it. You can see the signatures there signing it. This was an attempt for peace when Yasser Arafat was alive. And here we have from the Peace Museum in Nagasaki, Where in Japan they take peace seriously because of the atomic bomb was dropped on them. Twice.